So, Germany is struggling with some agonizing dilemmas about its relationship with China right now. It's trying to get its head around two seemingly conflicting ideas. That China made modern Germany rich on the one hand, and that it might bring about Germany's downfall on the other. Well, if that sounds overdramatic, stay with us because we're going to dig deep into these dilemmas today on Berlin Briefing, and most importantly, what Germany is going to do about them. We've got Michaela here, fresh back from Friedrich Merz's first trip to China as Chancellor, and we have Thorsten from the GPPi, who's been shouting from the rooftops in a think tanky sort of way about the dangers of a China shock for Germany. So great to have you both with us. Michaela, just kick us off first of all. Yeah, so we had Friedrich Merz in China, very, very quick visit. He went there with a set of asks, things he really wanted to raise with the Chinese side. What did he want to get out of this visit?
Well, first of all, he needs China to stabilize the German car industry, which is a measuring stick for how well the German economy is doing and the psychological state of Germany when it comes to reforms. He wants to conduct reforms here in Germany. So he needs to stabilize kind of the old style strong German industries. And for that, he needs the Chinese to back off a bit in terms of, he didn't use the word dumping, but in terms of sending all their goods that they can no longer sell to the US to Germany. He did address that very clearly. Then there, of course, is the issue of Ukraine. China is a huge supporter of Russia. Many analysts say that Russia really could potentially crumble unless it got support from China. The buzzword is dual-use goods. And he has no illusion that China will say, yes, you're right, we're going to drop support. But it's the small steps that count, sending at least a signal to the Russians that they can't do whatever they want. Now, we all remember in the past that Olaf Scholz did celebrate it as his success, although there's some doubts whose success it really was in the end, that Russia could no longer threaten to go nuclear in Ukraine. Now it's about trying to get China convinced, which is a tall order, that a stable Europe is in China's interest. Well, it is in the sense that China needs the European market, but in the overall strategy of China's drive to become the number one in the world economically and also the country who determines how international politics is done, it's not in China's interest to have a strong EU. Yeah. And that was a very difficult balance that he tried to strike.
Yeah. And Thorsten, I mean, you've been, like I just mentioned in the intro, you've been writing about this idea of a China shock about to hit Germany or in the process of hitting Germany, a bit like there was an earlier China shock that hit the United States. So this feeds into what Michaela was just explaining there. Like, explain what for you is the China shock that is facing Germany.
It's twofold, right? One is our China trap in terms of dependencies of supply chains, critical minerals plus other industrial supply chains where if that was cut due to a Taiwan crisis, we would be in dire straits. We saw that with chips last fall. But the even more severe for the longer term prosperity of Germany is that China, I think for legitimate reasons, has achieved moving up the value chain and is competing with all the core industries that made Germany rich: chemicals, automotive, machine tools. And China is a leader now in all these industries with the tools of authoritarian state capitalism. One, innovation, but the other one, manipulating your currency. The Chinese currency is 30% undervalued. That gives you an edge. Extensive subsidies and just excessive production because Chinese consumers are not buying and the economy is in depression at home. So you're pumping all these goods to the European market and to third markets where German companies get obliterated in competition. So that's the China shock. Our core industries are facing mortal threats, and also future industries, robotics and biotechnology and so on. And we need to find an answer as Germany and as Europe in order to, how to deal with this competition. And just talking nice with Mr. Xi, Friedrich Merz made the attempt. I think it's really right that he went, established a relationship, was the first visit as Chancellor. That's good. He tried to kill them with kindness and friendliness and packaged all his complaints in extremely friendly language. Now we need to take stock how much he got out of this.
Yeah.
I would posit he got out nothing.
Well, let's come to that. Yes. So I wanna dive in. Like, basically, we've set out the problems. Yeah. So we have this China shock, which is a combination of China becoming a huge competitor instead of a place to make money for Germany, and also China's control over these supply chains, and then this issue of supporting Russia. Yeah. So you basically got these kind of like sort of three sets of things. So let's take a look at how Merz has been dealing with that. Now, you just mentioned, Thorsten, that Merz was quite friendly. Yeah. So we've got a soundbite from when Merz set down at the beginning of his meeting with Xi Jinping, the Chinese supreme leader. Let's listen to that, and I'll come to you, Michaela.
There are challenges that we should talk about today, but the framework we're operating in is exceptionally good, and we've worked together very well for decades. Germany has been doing business in China for decades with great success.
So, as Thorsten indicated there, I mean, Merz was packaging what he referred to there as challenges with an awful lot of positive stuff around it. Can you explain his thinking?
Well, he was more explicit ahead of this meeting in terms of his complaints towards China. I do want to add that. And he did name specifically the trade imbalance, which is 87 billion of a trade deficit. So Germany importing so much more goods. So he did do that very clearly. He was more polite meeting Xi Jinping, and that's also a cultural issue. And what he has in the back of his mind sitting there is that German car makers have lost between 30 and in the case of Porsche, even 60% of their market share in China. The Chinese consumers no longer think that made in Germany is that terribly sexy. They've created their own brands. That is a huge problem for him. There's the trade imbalance, and then there's a small scene which really shows how the tables have turned. I was in China also with Olaf Scholz and Angela Merkel before, and there the constant complaint was that there was intellectual property rights that really was a huge concern. It continues to be a concern, but we went to this robotics company, Unitree, which creates these partially AI steered but still manually steered robots who can dance, who have movements that no other company is able to create such smooth movements at the moment. And we were filming, and the engineers told us to stop filming because they are now concerned that the Germans will steal their intellectual property and their technological edge. So the formula of the past, and he did recognize this, is that the technological edge is no longer made in Germany and made in Europe, and the Chinese simply produce. The technological edge, particularly on AI, has shifted. Yes, it's partly in the Silicon Valley, which is getting a bit arrogant, but it's really taking off in China. And that's the market of the future. And that is something where even the chancellor of the third largest economy speaking to the president of the second largest economy is on the defensive here. That's what was in the back of his mind. And he needs to ensure that German companies still make a profit because they're struggling here on their own market. And at the same time, he recognizes and tells companies that if they continue to invest large scale, they will end up being on their own if anything goes wrong.
Well, let's get to that in a second, because I want to get into this kind of contrast in the language. Because we have one more soundbite here from just a week ago. Friedrich Merz speaking at the CDU party conference, his own party conference here in Germany, just talking about how he views China in as a global power.
China is positioning itself in explicit opposition to the United States and seeking to define a new multilateral order with rules of its own. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of the press do not feature.
So, Thorsten, Friedrich Merz certainly did not say that to Xi Jinping's face. We can maybe understand that, but do you see a coherence between these sort of styles of communication, or do you think it becomes incoherent for Merz to be saying a week ago, kind of breathing fire on China, and then when he shows up in China saying, as we just heard there, that the framework is exceptionally good?
I think it's worth a shot, right? It's his first visit as Chancellor. He wants to build a relationship, and he wants to. I mean, I understood his approach as trying how far he can get with friendliness and packaging the list of complaints that he has in friendliness.
But just a second,
and so that's fine. I don't think it contradicts anything that he said or did before.
But the Chinese would have seen his speech and
exactly. So
it's not like they don't know he's saying that.
That's fine, but I think it makes a difference if you visit somebody and then you berate them in their house, whereas back home you say something. Anyway, let's not belabor that point for too long, because the proof of the pudding for me is what he now takes away as lesson from this.
Yeah.
You said he got something out of this. I don't think he got anything that at least we've seen reported. So he got an agreement on chicken feet. We can maybe export a few more chicken feet. It's a bit humiliating, I would say. So you got 120 Airbus. That's not reassuring either, because the Chinese are out. Their goal is in 5 years down the road, they want to make their own Airbus. They want to force Airbus to do the final bits of technology transfer, and then they'll order their own. This is just the remnant of the old model. It's not at all reassuring. And then we got a little agreement on the German Football League and table tennis. What else is in store? There's no acknowledgement on the Chinese side that they will change course on the currency manipulation, that they will change, rebalance their overall model. There's nothing of that sort. Read the joint communiqué. Germany and China agreed on a joint statement, by the way, in which Mr. Merz agreed to the language, not talking about a Ukraine war, but the Ukraine problem, which is quite remarkable. But let's get back. What the statement says, Germany issued these, it lists Germany's grudges, and then it lists China's grudges, because they say we complain about overcapacity and so on, and currency stuff. And they say, oh, you're securitizing the relationship. You do export controls, you do technology controls, you don't allow Huawei to run your critical infrastructure and so on. It's just a side-by-side acknowledgement. We have these complaints, they have these complaints, and I think zero progress. That maybe you've experienced, that he got reassurances or any sort of breakthrough on the big questions about how to deal with the China shock. But I think the answer dealing with the China shock is at home in Europe. What we do, and the answer will not come from the Chinese leadership.
Michaela.
Although it's totally frustrating to you, but nobody on the German delegation ever, also in advance, said that there would be a breakthrough on anything. This is a visit of the magnitude of his first trip to see Donald Trump, where it was basically about Donald Trump picking up the phone to him, and this was the aim of this visit. I think it's totally debatable whether it was necessary to have a signing ceremony of minor agreements, which were sporting agreements and, chicken, and it was... it was a kind of non-event because it really is not significant at all. I think it's noteworthy that he, as a leader of the opposition, saw himself as a critic in chief of the Scholz government to get tougher on China, and that he now found himself in a position. We saw that soundbite from the CDU, but he went there and clearly pulled out his diplomacy and was a lot more soft-spoken. It's not the first time that we've seen Merz try to please the audience where he is. Also, just a more general point about how he communicates and how he tunes into situations that he goes into. Of course, we asked the question, what exactly comes out of this? I think the Airbus is a great example because it was a very carefully staged.
So just explain what the Airbus announcement was.
Yes, the announcement is that China will buy 120 Airbus, which is a huge deal.
Up to.
Yes. Interesting and important to know is that parts needed to assemble them are made in the United States. So if the US wants to block this, they can. And I think this And although his visit next week to Trump is a complete coincidence in terms of the timing, it genuinely is, because this was a meeting that was offered months ago before China was actually clear. This will be very interesting how he manages to marry his charm offensive to China out of pure necessity, which we can see in the economic figures, with German exports to China plummeting despite the fact that there still is solid growth in China, with the demands that clearly Donald Trump will put on him in terms of talking tough on China. He did make the point about the one China policy and Taiwan, only some kind of reunification only being possible if both sides want it and there's no violence involved, which is pretty much also the US stance. But I suspect he will be speaking to Donald Trump and there will be expectations to talk tougher on China. And I wouldn't be surprised if in that forum he does. So
exactly. I don't rule this out. By the way, Trump is on a charm offensive vis-a-vis Xi himself. He has banned his foreign minister from even talking about China when he complains about them, or even he didn't mention the term China in the State of the Union. So I don't expect much pressure actually from the US side, but I do think Merz will face pressure at home. Because your theory of change, you just talk nicely to the Chinese leadership and then Chinese consumers will buy more cars and they will also stop obliterating our export industries. I don't think that will work. So we will need to take some other...
Let's get to that now.
Some other measures.
I want to get to that now because the sort of the official policy of the government, and this is also a carryover from the previous government, is that it needs to talk about de-risking the relationship between Germany and China, and this is in a broader context of Europe wanting to do that, to reduce the risk of dependency on supply chains So I just want to read a quote from Friedrich Merz wrote in the magazine Foreign Affairs just recently talking about this. So he said, Germany is updating its relationship with China. Above all, we will further de-risk by reducing dependencies. We will work hard to ensure fair competition and level playing fields for both sides. Michaela, from your impressions from Merz on this trip, is he committed to this idea of de-risking, or is he actually thinking we need to do everything we can to, make sure that we hold on to what we've got in China?
He's fully committed to the principle of de-risking, but he knows he just can't pull it off on rare earths. It's not possible. At the moment, China could single-handedly stop the rearmament of Europe by withdrawing their exports of rare earths. And that's a huge problem. And it also exposes the inability, particularly of European governments, to think longer term and to secure, for instance, rare earths longer term. It also shows certain limits of democracies to plan ahead. Like the Chinese, they wrote in their past 5-year plan that they will utilize their economic power to, and I don't have the exact wording, but to impose their strategic interests in the world. So this is not a surprise that China would do this. And yet it catches the Europeans by surprise. So yes, he wants to de-risk, but he doesn't really have anywhere to go with China dominating this market.
So, and I mean, they are scrambling around trying to get contracts for rare earth supplies.
I know Thorsten is involved in advising the government on this. So
No, I wouldn't claim that at all. But I do agree that Chancellor Merz is committed to de-risking. He clearly sees the dangers and he wants to de-risk. The question is whether he pursues this with the necessary tools and the necessary sense of urgency, given all the other demands on his time and his government's time. And there is where my question marks. His commitment, I don't doubt at all. But the question marks, I have 2 question marks. One, on critical minerals and technology, do we have the necessary institutions and mechanisms for economic and technology statecraft in place to do that? Is there a person at the Chancellery waking up every morning and say, how can we reduce our dependencies on supply chains? Because it takes active government action to do that. I think the answer is no. And the problem is also with our Minister for the Economy, Katharina Reiche. She doesn't understand herself as an economic security minister, which she would, that should be a central part of her job. And the second question where I have doubts is that Mr. Merz doesn't fully understand what it takes to become competitive in the competition of systems with authoritarian state capitalism, that is China. He understands that we need to deregulate and free ourselves from overregulation and cut down our costs. That we all need to do. I think we need to do this and become more innovative in Germany. But it also takes measures to actually intervene in the market, because China has, for example, produced a monopoly on rare earths. Only state intervention will break that stranglehold. But more importantly, in terms of protecting industries against this glut of Chinese exports, you need to actually put up some barriers. And that's very antithetical to everything Mr. Merz believes in, to everything German order liberals believe in. But it's the unfortunate reality in the world dominated by Trump and Xi that you need to resort to some protective measures.
And this is what the European Commission is currently working on, and European leaders are debating. And this is actually what Friedrich Merz did mention as a potentially needed in China. He did address this. And this is the only leverage the Europeans have and Germany has, that something might happen in Brussels that limits China's ability to export into Europe. That's not much of a leverage when you have, it is a big leverage, but at the same time, when the Chinese have a stranglehold on key industries that are highly relevant for defense purposes, that really is quite something. And rare earths, we all know that they're not really that terribly rare. It's just that societies are not willing to pay the cost. We're currently seeing a huge debate in Serbia, which has huge reserves, but there's a lot of pressure from the public who simply don't want the environmental impact. And this is also what China provides. It takes the whole question of environmental impact, everything that is hotly debated in our societies is just not an issue in the system of China, where the central government just orders what happens and people pay the price.
There's another aspect of de-risking I want to get into before we wrap. So, because we've talked about de-risking, dependence on things like rare earths, where the dependency is extremely clear. But there's another aspect of German economic dependency on China, and that is dependency on the Chinese market. Let's listen to Merz's speech to a foreign policy foundation here in Berlin early last year, so just before the election last year.
I tell everyone in the German business community a decision to invest in China is a very risky decision. If you do take this risk, do so in a way that wouldn't endanger your whole company if you had to write this investment off from one year to the next. And under no circumstances should you come running to the government or to the Federal Republic of Germany to bail you out in a situation like that.
So, Michaela, you referred to this just briefly earlier, and I tried to move us on to this because I wanted to come to it in a concrete question. So that was a very clear message from Merz, saying to German, basically car makers, but a couple of other big German industries, that if you get overexposed, if you build too many factories in China, if things go pear-shaped with, for instance, Taiwan, don't come running to us to help us. Now he goes to China with 30 business leaders, including the CEOs, if I'm right, of all of the big German car makers with him on that plane. Do the optics of this trip really cohere with what he said last year, or does this suggest that he's softening on this?
Well, car makers are the favorite child of any German chancellor, so there will always be an exception for them. And that's why they can be pretty relaxed when he said something like this, still being the candidate for chancellor. And in principle, from the conversations we've had, which I'm not allowed to quote from, but he stands by this in principle. At the same time, when car makers stop making their profits there, they will have to sack, and they already are sacking workers here in Germany. And that is something where exceptions will be created. And we saw the whole question on CO2 neutral engines, that being postponed, that allows them to still continue with their old model of marketing, but it's not working in China. The Chinese market simply doesn't get excited about German cars anymore, and particularly the e-cars, and that may postpone them hitting a wall in terms of sales, but they will always be rescued.
And why hasn't this become a bigger political issue yet? Because you've got Volkswagen, for instance, saying recently that it could completely develop an EV in China without any input from Germany, that it could export that EV from China to growth markets in Latin America or in the Middle East, and at the same time is cutting jobs in Germany. I mean, why isn't there not a, question for either of you, why is there not a populist uprising against that?
That will come. Don't worry about it. That's why I'm warning, because we better get ahead of the curve, because the US didn't get ahead of the curve in its China shock and ended up with Trump. We'll end up with something similar if we don't actually address this and go beyond just talking nicely to the Chinese leadership and hoping that they'll buy more Volkswagens.
Detroit was made in China, basically. The whole
the fundamental fact is the interests of Volkswagen are no longer the interests of Germany. It's partly a Chinese company. The same with Mercedes. So you need to take with a grain of salt what the leaders of Volkswagen say. Take them along on the planes. Just don't listen to their advice. Rather listen to the advice of mechanical engineering and machine tool makers, which are getting obliterated now, and they're calling for protection now.
And the business community is divided, isn't it?
The business community is divided, and it's divided between those who, like Volkswagen, think they don't actually, they believe that they can produce more cheaply for the world and for Europe, also in China. They're moving a lot of their production there, and they think that is part of their future. And between companies that don't think they can or should move all their production to China, and that are committed to the European market and producing here. So, and I think in terms of, I do think the Chancellor means what he says, we won't bail you out. The question is whether he can actually make good on that promise. I think in terms of market dependencies on China, Chinese consumers are taking care of this. They're just not buying the stuff anymore, or Chinese companies are not buying the supplies from German production in China. So I think that will sort itself out. What I'm worried about is supply chain dependencies. In a Taiwan contingency, by the way, we shouldn't talk about reunification, because Taiwan and the People's Republic of China were never one entity. They were always separate. And in a Taiwan contingency, we have so many supply chain dependencies also on China that might get cut. And we just need to make sure that we de-risk, as Mr. Merz says, in a conscious way, so that we're able to withstand such a shock from a Taiwan contingency without our industrial production being cut or our medical supplies supply chains being stopped. And that's what we need to focus on very calmly, very deliberately at home. And that's the homework I think Mr. Merz brought from his I think quite enlightening trip to China. It's good that he went. It's good that we conclude he didn't get that much out of it. I think you're right. We couldn't have expected for a lot. He tried his best, and that's fine. I think the homework right now is back here to get this agenda in order to become more competitive in this competition with authoritarian state capitalism here in Europe. And there's a long list of things we have to do as Germany, and we need to get the whole government moving, including our Minister for the Economy.
Michaela, as a final thought to you. I mean, you were in the press gaggle on this trip. Friedrich Merz did not take a single question, in front of the camera at least, from any of you on this whole trip. Does that indicate, do you think, well, what does that indicate? And does this also indicate a concern that he doesn't have good answers to the questions that you would pose?
Well, from an observer's point of view and someone who was there, the government stresses that there's no deeper meaning to this, but of course it's quite telling. Yes, exactly, they would. It's quite telling when the leader of Europe's largest economy goes to China for 2 days, does 2 press statements, and doesn't take any on-the-record questions. He took a lot of off-the-record questions, took a lot of time for journalists, but doesn't take a single on-the-record question. So that is, I think that also speaks for itself. I think the underlying homework he's come back with is whether he has, and power is always won or lost back home, whether he has the power back here to actually develop and implement the tools that he needs to do exactly what Thorsten just said. And that will not be enough to try and convince companies here to buy more expensive rare earths somewhere else out of strategic reasons. It just requires a different tool for that. And the Americans have that already. They're willing to do this. I have big question marks whether he's going to come up with a tool fast enough to really get more independent.
If we don't solve this is the easiest part. If we don't solve the critical mineral stuff, we will fail at everything else. And I think we better get cracking.
Yeah, and what we've seen him do is walk a very fine line between a charm offensive and being able to tick off all the pressure points. And he did mention every single pressure point very directly.
And as you said, he indicated that if nothing changes, we will be compelled to pull up barriers, introduce tariffs and other barriers. And I do think that was a veiled threat to the Chinese side. The question now is, if the Chinese side doesn't change, we don't follow through on this threat, then of course we look like a paper tiger that can be coerced quite easily in terms of our dependencies to keep our market open, even as our companies are getting obliterated. So now the big question is, do we act as we say we would act, in friendly language, but very deliberate action? And I think, as we agree, that's the homework that the government has to do now with its European partners.
As with any of the strategic questions, Europe is the answer and will have to be the answer. Germany on its own is a smaller unit, but also in the European context, we just observed Germany trying to make life easier for German car makers. And they will not snap out of that anytime soon. It simply is not popular with the German public. And now he heads to Washington, and his task there will be not to land where Europe doesn't want to be, which is squeezed between the United States and China. Trump may be more soft-talking on China right now, but that doesn't mean he doesn't want the Europeans to do the tough work for him. And that will be his balance that he has to strike, while trying to keep Trump on Europe's side over the very strategic issue of European defense, and more specifically the Ukraine war. He's meeting 2 of the 3 men he himself says could end this war within the space of a week, just over a week. And that is, of course, the US president and Xi Jinping, and neither look like they're going to make any significant and fast move on that.
Well, he's certainly having to multitask, that's for sure. Michaela and Thorsten, thank you so much for this kind of whirlwind ride through Germany's dilemmas over China. That wraps up this edition of Berlin Briefing. Thank you very much for watching on YouTube or listening on whichever podcast provider you find us on. And one special mention, we're doing a survey on YouTube of your thoughts about Berlin Briefing, what you think we could do better, what you think we already do well. So please do look out for that. That's in the teaser below the YouTube video. And of course, if you haven't, please also do sign up for our Berlin Briefing newsletter. That's on dw.com. That's a great roundup of weekly news from Germany. But for now, from all 3 of us here in Berlin, thanks for watching.